Alright guys, so I got an absolutely wild story here because one of the major Boeing whistleblowers who was coming forward against the company over major safety concerns and honestly rampant levels of corruption was just found dead under incredibly mysterious circumstances as he was basically in the midst of giving a testimony against the company. Okay, so here from NPR, they say Boeing whistleblower John Barnett, who raised alarm over plane quality, is found dead. So a little bit of details here. They say police in Charleston, South Carolina are investigating the death of John Barnett, a former Boeing quality control manager who became a whistleblower when he went public with his concerns about serious safety issues in the company's commercial airplanes. They say that Barnett's body was found in a vehicle in a Holiday Inn parking lot in Charleston on Saturday, according to the cops, and one day earlier, he had just testified in a deposition about the string of problems that he says he identified at Boeing's plant where he once helped inspect the 787 Dreamliner aircraft before delivery to customers. Police said that officers were sent to the hotel to conduct a welfare check after people were unable to contact Barnett, who had just traveled to Charleston to testify in his lawsuit against Boeing. Okay, incredibly suspicious circumstances. Now, I'm not going to claim that Boeing murdered this guy for testifying against the company. I'm not going to claim that, but I'll leave it up to you guys to interpret the context of this entire situation. We're going to read some more details of it here in a second, but I just want to remind you guys of some of the recent, major safety issues, to say the least, that we have seen from Boeing. So, I mean, keep in mind, guys, this is one of the, flagship American companies, right? It's been around for decades. It's absolutely gargantuan. It's worth tens and tens of billions of dollars. So this is not a company that you would expect to have such glaring issues with it, right? This is not a startup. What we have here is an example of capitalism absolutely eating a company from the inside out. Okay, we have the prioritization of shareholder profits of Wall Street and executives over safety and over workers and over the quality of the product that they are producing. We also have a story here of a lack of regulation, or basically a situation where the regulators aren't doing their jobs and are basically allowing Boeing to regulate themselves, which brings about a whole host of other issues. But just some recent examples here of some of the issues. I mean, this was just from last month. Boeing 737 was missing bolts before a door plug flew off during Alaska Airlines flight. So, I mean, a door fell off in the middle of the flight. Okay, now it turns out that this was somewhat of a relatively lucky situation because apparently nobody was seated in the seat that was directly next to the door, and thankfully people had seatbelts on and it wasn't at the altitude where things could have been catastrophically worse. So maybe it was a relatively lucky situation with this specific instance, but I would personally prefer that my plane doors don't just randomly fly off because some people failed to put in the right bolts into the door plug. Seems like a pretty basic request. I mean, I'm not somebody who's scared of flights for the most part, right? I'm a pretty good flyer, but honestly, at this point, I would not want to fly on a Boeing plane, right? Which is completely insane because this is a company that, for a vast majority of its history, had a pretty good safety track record, right? Had a pretty good reputation. But in the last couple of years, as again, they've allowed their prioritization of shareholders and their stock price to completely outweigh any sort of quality protections or safety or workers or investment in the product, all of that has gone away, right? We also had this. The FAA audited Boeing 737 MAX production, and they found dozens of issues. I mean, this is an insane ratio here, guys. They say the company failed 33 out of 89 audits. That's over 1/3 of the audits during an examination conducted by the Federal Aviation Administration after a panel, again, blew off an Alaska Airlines jet back in January. We also had this. I mean, this is the level that we're at, guys. The FAA found staff at Boeing's supplier using liquid Dawn soap as a lubricant for a 737 MAX door seal. Liquid Dawn soap, like the shit that you would find in your kitchen. They're using this on a Boeing 737, okay, to lubricate the door seal. What are we doing? What are we doing here, guys? This just happened today or yesterday. 50 people injured after a strong movement, whatever that means, on a Boeing flight to New Zealand. So this just happened. We don't have many details on exactly what the cause was of this specific incident, but now we have, again, 50 people being injured after a mysterious strong movement, after the flight's tracking of the altitude of the plane apparently lost signal for like an hour during the flight. This just happened. 50 people injured, right? So we continue with some of the details in terms of Barnett here. They say that he spent decades working for Boeing at its plants in Everett, Washington, and North Charleston, South Carolina. He had repeatedly alleged that Boeing's manufacturing practices had declined, and that rather than improve them, he added, managers had pressured workers not to document potential defects and problems. And I'll show you guys a video interview that he recently did with TMZ here, where he sort of elaborates on that. Now here we get just an amazing quote. Boeing says, "We are saddened by Mr. Barnett's passing, and our thoughts are with his family and friends. I'm sure that the corporate board at Boeing is deeply saddened by the passing of a guy who was just testifying against you in a massive scandal that is costing your company probably billions and billions of dollars at the end of the day. I'm sure you guys are very upset about his passing, right?" They say that Barnett, who was age 62, made international headlines back in April of 2019 when he and other former Boeing employees spoke to the New York Times about what he called shoddy manufacturing problems at Boeing. Barnett accused the company of adopting a culture that prioritized raw numbers and profits over quality, and by extension, passenger safety. They say, quote, "As a quality manager at Boeing, you're the last line of defense before a defect makes it out to the flying public," he told the newspaper. "And I haven't seen a plane out of Charleston yet that I'd put my name on saying it's safe and airworthy." So this isn't even just an issue of like, maybe some planes have some small cosmetic defects or issues with them. He just said, I haven't seen a plane, not one, that came out of this plant that he would put his name on saying that it's safe and airworthy. So it's like as deep of a systemic issue as you could possibly imagine. They say by the time that the article appeared, Barnett had already filed a whistleblower complaint against Boeing, saying that his attempts to raise quality and safety problems had been ignored and that he was punished for continuing to flag them. They say that Barnett filed a whistleblower complaint back in early 2017, and his case against the company was heading towards a trial this June, that his family said. And they got some quotes here. Now this is where we get to some testimony from the family, right? They say he was looking forward to having his day in court and hoped that it would force Boeing to change its culture. The family shared this statement with NPR. They also say that the family has said that Barnett's health has declined because of the stresses of taking a stand against his longtime employer. They say, quote, "He was suffering from PTSD and anxiety attacks as a result of being subjected to the hostile work environment at Boeing, which we believe led to his death." So it looks like from these statements from the family, they do believe that maybe he was in the mental state where he may have just committed suicide. An incredible amount of stress and pressure and PTSD and anxiety from his decades of working for Boeing under the conditions they put him in, and then probably exasperated by the current lawsuit that he is engaged in and all of this testimony that he's having to give. So again, is it possible he just coincidentally happened to commit suicide in the middle of all of this? It's possible. It certainly is possible. Is it also still incredibly suspicious that like a day after he gives his testimony and as he's preparing to give more testimony while he's on this trip in Charleston, that he just so happens to be found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound in a Holiday Inn parking lot? I don't know. It is definitely suspicious, but again, I'm not going to say definitively one way or the other because I just don't know, right? So give me your guys' thoughts in the comments, what you guys think actually happened here. But now we move on to this. So this was the interview that he did recently with TMZ, where he's elaborating on some of the issues with Boeing.
One, this is not a 737 problem. It's a Boeing problem. And I know the FAA's gone in and they've done due diligence and inspections to assure that the door plugs of the 737 are installed properly and the fasteners are torqued properly. But my concern is, what's the rest of the airplane? What's the rest of the condition of the airplane? And the reason my concern for that is back in 2012, Boeing started removing inspection operations off their jobs. So it left the mechanics to buy off their own work. So what we're seeing with the door plug blowout is what I've seen with the rest of the airplane, as far as jobs not being completed properly, inspection steps being removed, issues being ignored. My concerns are with the 737 and the 787 because those programs have really embraced the theory that quality is overhead and non-value added. So those two programs have really put a strong effort into removing quality from the process. When I first started working at Charleston, I was in charge with pushing back defects to our suppliers. And what that meant was I'd take a group of inspectors and actually go to the supplier and inspect the product before they sent it in. Well, I'd taken a team of 4 inspectors to Spirit Aerosystems to inspect the 41 section before they sent it to Charleston. And we found 300 defects. Some of them were significant that needed engineering intervention. When I returned to Charleston, my senior manager told me that we had found too many defects and he was going to take the next trip. So the next trip he went on, he took 2 of my inspectors. And when they got back, they were given accolades for only finding 50 defects. So I pulled that inspector aside and I said, did Spirit really clean up their act that quick? That don't sound right. And she was mad. She said, no. Said the 2 inspectors were given 2 hours to inspect the whole 41 section and they were kicked off the airplane.
I mean, again, guys, now the thing that stood out to me is where he's basically saying, you know, that Boeing as a company considers the quality of their product to be a zero value added sort of like overhead cost of their operation. In other words, they don't view the quality and the safety of the planes that we all are flying on as an important part of their company. They think the more important part is doing what he just gave an example of and cutting corners and cutting safety procedures just to save a little bit of money so that we can get the plane off the production line, so that we can get it approved and ship it off so that it can go be used commercially, right? So that Boeing can profit off of it, regardless of the safety standards. I mean, he found over 300 different issues, and then his manager says, you found too many issues, whatever that means. I mean, listen, if there's issues, there's issues. You got to fix them before people are put into those planes, right? But then his manager goes on the trip. He takes 2 people instead of 4. They give them 2 hours to inspect the entire plane, and they find, what do you know, only 50 or so issues with the plane. And then they're given accolades for that, as if they did something good. They didn't do something good. You just ignored the whatever 200 or so other issues, 300 that he had just found. You just ignored 300 of those issues, right? Pretended as if they didn't exist. And again, it's not as if this hasn't had consequences, guys. We've seen all of these different stories that in some cases are catastrophic. I mean, there have been some instances where people have died as a part of Boeing, you know, crashes that have happened over the last couple of years. I'll tell you about one of those here in a minute. But I mean, this is sort of reiterating the point that he was just giving there. So this is from Bloomberg from about a month or so ago. They say 2 ex-Boeing staffers said that they wouldn't fly on the 737 MAX, citing pressure to rush the planes out the doors. So, I mean, just a couple quotes here. These are former people who worked on getting this plane up and running, right? I would absolutely not fly on a MAX airplane, said Ed Pearson, a former senior manager at Boeing. Okay? He said, I've worked in the factory where they were built, and I saw the pressure employees were under to rush the planes out the door. Guys, if a senior manager at this company is saying he would not fly on the planes that are being approved, that we are all flying on, then we've got a fucking issue here. Okay? And at this point, I don't even know how we're still letting Boeing planes go up in the air. I mean, you almost have to do like a full, complete shutdown of the company, audit the whole thing, nationalize it. Honestly, if we were being sensible about any of this, I think Boeing as a company has demonstrated that they cannot be trusted to run a for-profit operation in the first place. But I mean, you kind of need like a full and complete shutdown and an audit of this whole company, because clearly it's not just a couple planes, it's the whole entire operation. And this was a good article here from Jacobin, and I suggest you guys all, you know, read the entire thing here, because they get into some of the history of what changed sort of the company focus and structure and culture, right? But just some numbers here in terms of how much they've spent on stock buybacks in the recent years. They say here from Jacobin, while the companies responsible for the door plug that blew out of a plane mid-air last week were cutting corners, outsourcing manufacturing, laying off employees, and working to evade expensive safety upgrades, they paid their top executives $817 million and showered Wall Street investors with $68 billion. $68 billion in dividends and stock buybacks over the past decade. Think about that, guys. Over the past decade, $68 billion for stock buybacks and dividends. Stock buybacks should be completely illegal. Stock buybacks are just where a company buys back its own stock explicitly in an effort to artificially jack up the stock price. It's stock manipulation 101. It should be completely illegal. But not only is it legal for these companies to engage in, but that's where they're dumping almost all of their money. They're not reinvesting their money back into the company to improve the product, to improve the safety, to give their workers better pay and better benefit packages. They're doing the opposite of that. They are explicitly going out of their way to avoid investments in the quality of the product, in their workers, in the safety, so that they can spend that money on stock buybacks, which should be totally illegal in the first place. I mean, this is just a fundamentally broken economic system. I mean, this kind of like overinvestment in stock buybacks and dividends for Wall Street ghouls, that's typical for every American company for the most part, right? All of these massive, billion-dollar corporations in the United States, they all do this to some extent. It just so happens that when you're making fucking planes, it can have some more significant consequences. Meaning people's lives are at stake, right? We're not talking about like McDonald's, okay? Even though that would bring about its own host of issues with the safety of the food and the workers and the treatment of them. But like, you're building planes, guys. I mean, this is engineering that we're talking about here. You can't just cut corners and expect it not to have catastrophic consequences. They say by some estimates, the amount spent on stock buybacks that enriched shareholders was more than the projected cost of making safety upgrades that experts said were necessary. Boeing, a manufacturer of the 737 MAX 9 jet that suffered the mid-flight rupture last week, laid off tens of thousands of workers back in 2020 following the grounding of its entire 737 MAX fleet after two catastrophic crashes that killed together 346 people. That same year, the company's new CEO, David Calhoun, made over $21 million, a $6.8 million increase from what the prior CEO made. So you see what's happening here, guys? Okay, the CEOs, the executives, they're all getting million-dollar bonuses, okay, multi-million-dollar bonuses, at the same time as they're laying off workers, at the same time that they are cutting corners on safety requirements. I mean, again, it's not just a failure of capitalism that we're witnessing here. Again, it's also a failure of regulation. Because these companies like Boeing, to a large extent, they're allowed to regulate themselves. That's a problem. They cannot be trusted to regulate themselves, clearly. Okay? If a company kills 350 people nearly, and then they turn around and they give a $6.8 million bonus to their CEO, above what the previous one got, you're just failing upwards. You can make the most catastrophic mistake possible to the point where hundreds of people are killed, and you'll get a couple $1 million as a sort of like gift package there. We also had this. So part of those catastrophic crashes that happened that ended up getting hundreds of people killed, I looked a little bit more into this, and I think one of the crashes, and I'm no like plane technical engineering expert or whatever, but my understanding of it is that part of the reason that the crash happened is because Boeing, with this new fleet that they were, rushing out the door and getting up into the skies, they made this pretty massive adjustment and included a new sensor that was supposed to like adjust the pitch of the plane, right? In case it, was starting to nosedive then, or to stall out, then it would adjust the positioning of the plane like that. And the reason they did that is because they, again, were rushing the plane out the door to try to compete with some of their competitors who were building other planes, and they changed the positioning of the engines on the plane, and whatever. They had their reasoning internally in their heads to put this new sensor on the plane to adjust the pitch of the plane, right? And it turns out they didn't even really tell the pilots who were going to be flying these planes that this sensor even existed, okay? I mean, think about that. A sensor that is supposed to drastically be able to react to the environment to adjust the plane's pitch, which way its nose is facing, up or down, and they don't tell the pilots about it or how that process works. And it also turns out that the sensor had glaring flaws just in and of itself, to the point where like it could be accidentally activated by like a balloon accidentally flying into the sensor, okay? So I mean, this is the kind of shit that's happening at Boeing. In the meantime, this is what they get for their employees, right? Pilots trained for Boeing 737 MAX airplane with an iPad lesson for an hour. So you made significant changes to the technology in catastrophic situations that could completely change how a pilot needs to react in a moment's time to save the people on board, and you gave them an iPad lesson for an hour. Now, the reason that they apparently gave this iPad lesson to them instead of actually doing a full training circuit is because this was one of the selling pitches that they were giving for this new plane that they were unveiling. Is like, you guys are going to be able to save money because you won't have to train your pilots, because it's basically the same plane. It just turns out like whoopsie daisies, we didn't tell you about this new sensor that we put in place, and the pilots were completely caught off guard and didn't know how to react. What the fuck? What are we doing here, guys? An hour. An iPad lesson for an hour, guys. So we had this. The FAA gives Boeing 90 days to develop plan to address systemic quality control issues. I mean, again, nationalize the fucking company. I don't know how many years it takes, how many people have to die, how many plane doors have to fly off the hinges in the middle of a flight for people to realize this. They've already proven themselves not to be capable of running a for-profit operation. Nationalize the company. Are you telling me that the government couldn't do a better job? I mean, I know people have issues with the government, right? Obviously, our government is massively, wildly corrupt. It can't be more corrupt than this. I'm sorry. It physically is impossible to be more corrupt and incompetent than what Boeing has put on display over the last number of years. What you could do if you nationalize it, just remove the profit incentive. You don't have to spend $70 billion on stock buybacks or whatever. You don't have to give $28 million to your CEOs and your executives. You don't have to give the dividends out to the shareholders. Just run the company, okay? Just make sure you got planes, you're hiring as many engineers as you need, put the quality controls in place, build the fucking planes, make sure that they're safe, and then we can feel safe flying on them, right? It shouldn't be that difficult to run that kind of an operation unless you are going so far out of your way to ignore everything that the engineers are saying, everything that the quality control people are saying, everything that your workers are saying, everything that even the FAA is warning you about. You have to go so far out of your way in order for us to get to the point that we're at right now. So fuck them. Nationalize the company. I don't know how you can make an argument that, okay, we're just going to give you guys a couple months, come up with some sort of a plan, and I'm sure that everything's going to be great from here on out. No, it's not. No, it's not. Unless you're fundamentally changing the incentives of a capitalist system, I guess, which I don't anticipate that they're gearing up to do. And so they also have this. Justice Department is opening a criminal probe of Boeing for this mid-flight blowout on the 737 MAX plane. So, I mean, listen, guys, the main point of this story is not even necessarily that this guy, Barnett, was found dead. I guess that's sort of just like a loop into the video. You know, it's the latest thing people are talking about. The real point of this video is the issues of Boeing, right? And the issues of capitalism in general. The issues of a lack of regulation and enforcement ability from the government, to the point where Boeing is basically just regulating themselves. They're cutting corners. They're not investing in safety. They're not investing in their workers. They're laying off thousands of workers at the same time that they're spending tens of billions on stock buybacks. It is a fundamental issue with a lack of regulation from the government, okay, and a core issue with the capitalist system. And even more specifically, that we allow these companies to spend money on things like stock buybacks in the first place. So there's a lot of like fundamental issues that are at play here. I'll be interested to see what the Justice Department criminal probe turns out. I'll be interested to see what Boeing's 90-day safety plan to completely turn around the company ends up being. And yeah, I mean, I guess let me know what you guys think about the circumstances of the whistleblower's death. Because again, it could have been he just, happened to be in a really bad mental space, and that's what led to it. It could also be something incredibly conspiratorial and suspicious, to say the least.